Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Scrum Down NBC Sports Rugby podcast. I am your host with the most, Alex Kubasarian. It is great to be back, everyone. Lots to talk about as we react to the Premiership semi-finals that were on the weekend. Both games live on CNBC here in America with myself and Dan Lyle in studio, as well as live on Peacock TV. In the second half of this podcast, we will have Ross Hamilton back on, performance analyst, to go through those games by the numbers, break down some of the stats, thoughts on the game. I give my 10 cents too, as well as I covered it as well. Really good chat. But then the first half of this pod is sadly a continuation of the London Irish story. And this has been something that's been developing over these. This is our third pod covering it. It's been an ongoing story, and it's kind of been one of those ones that slowly snowballed. You know, I've been shocked maybe about how some of the other podcasts haven't quite picked it up or covered it as much, because I think it is a massive story, and I think there's some potential warning signs here that, you know, need to take note and try and put as much pressure on all parties involved to try and find a workable solution so we don't lose our third Premiership club of the year. And for me, one that's very close to my heart and very much, causing me a lot of grief of the thoughts of what if this doesn't happen with this potential takeover, and also what it means for the players, staff, all the hardworking people that behind the scenes at that club that do everything to keep it going and make it as great as we all think it is. So, you know, to continue the developments over the stories over this last week or so of what's been going on, the latest information, we're bringing Alex Lowe back from the Times. He was really the first journalist that actually started reporting on this, that broke the story, and who's been consistently coming with the biggest updates and information on it. So reminder to stay in the now. Even when you're listening to this, there might be new news that has broken. To check out Alex Lowe on Twitter. I usually retweet it when he posts on this topic, but keep an eye out on his Twitter and his articles at the Times for the latest on this developing story. It's not looking great. There's still hope. We've had some revelations of, you know, big names potentially attached to this group, which giving people, you know, some confidence or hope going in. But there's also a lot of worries as the deadline, which has been set by the RFU, is starting to loom. And to dissect that and give us all the latest of what is going on there, let's get into our chat with Alex Lowe. And we are joined again by the returning Alex Lowe. Obviously, this London Irish story hasn't gone away, and it's been developing since our last chat, so we had to get you back on the pod. Welcome, mate. There's been a few updates since we last spoke. Some of the big ones to me that I can sort of remember from the news headlines is that there's been a deadline set of May 30th for London Irish and this sale or takeover to go through, or a commitment from the current ownership that they will continue to fund the club to go through. If not, the club will be suspended. We've now learnt some of the names of certain individuals that are part of this group, but also potentially who is leading the group. And there's been some whispers leaking out of potentially what some of the sticking points are in this ongoing negotiation. But Alex, welcome, mate. And how's it all going on this story? You seem to be on the pulse of it. You broke the deadline story last week, long before it was confirmed this week. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Alex. You're right. The story isn't going away, but it's definitely coming to a head. As you say, last week, all the club, the players were told, I think on Thursday last week, that the RFU had imposed a deadline by which this takeover has to be completed, or Mick Crossan, the current owner, via his company Powerday, need to declare their commitment to fund London Irish through the whole of next season. That deadline is May the 30th. What's interesting for me about this, a couple of interesting things for me. There's a determination clearly from the authorities, from the RFU and Premiership Rugby, to try and force this takeover to happen. If there's a chance of it happening, they want to encourage it and put a bit of pressure on this consortium to actually make some progress. It's been stalled for months, certainly weeks, because they haven't provided, as we said last week, any proof of funds or other critical information required for this takeover to happen. So they're putting a bit of pressure on. They want this to be dealt with quickly. They want it to be a positive outcome, but if it's not positive, then they need it to be dealt with quickly. What's interesting for me, number two, is that we've been saying for a while that we're not sure whether Powerday, Mick Cross, and the current owners are ready to keep funding London Irish. The club have paid the last two salary runs £500,000 each month. My understanding is that they're not keen to continue funding it, and that those doubts are now official because, as you say, the RFU's deadline is either the takeover happens or the current owners provide proof and assurances that they will fund the club for another year. So those doubts are now official enough for the RFU to require proof from Powerday, and they're trying to put the pressure on. And so they want this to be done quickly. They want it to be positive, but if it's not positive, then they want it to be dealt with by the end of this month, so that there's time for players to find new opportunities, coaches to find new opportunities, and that this saga doesn't drag through the summer and start impacting on next season. We've seen what happens to the league when that was allowed to happen last off season with Worcester, and it caused all sorts of chaos. So they want this dealt with quickly, and if it has to be bad news, then they need to know it so that there's time to help the players out who will find themselves without jobs.
And that's the next development in the story that you reported on, is that the league is actually putting contingency plans together in case this sadly does fall through, that it would reduce the teams in the league. And I think from reading your coverage, also potentially allow dispensation in the salary cap, so London Irish players, especially the English players, I'm assuming, could be signed up by other teams.
That is one of the scenarios that is doing the rounds. I've heard it from other Premiership clubs. It'll be one of many contingency plans being worked on. I think what the big lesson that was learned by the authorities from what happened at the start of this season was that although they didn't have much power or authority to actually intervene and save these clubs, not enough was done to help the players and the staff and the employees once the clubs folded. And that's now a priority for the RFU and Premiership Rugby. Whether that involves helping players find new clubs by giving dispensation the salary cap, I'd say that's unlikely as it stands, but I've certainly heard it mentioned. Whether it's helping them find future employment outside of rugby, if this ends up being the end of their career, there's a desire within the game to be much more hands-on than existed when Wasps and Worcester went to the wall. And that's one of the key lessons that has been learned from the saga at the start of the season, is that if this goes up in smoke at London Irish, then there's a responsibility on the game to help those who have been failed by a failing club.
It is the 17th of May today, so we have 13 days until this deadline. Do you foresee this thing getting done? Is that enough time to get to the point that these two groups between Mick Crossan and the current ownership and this new potential consortium coming in to get these sort of deeds done and get this across the line?
There is time, because although any new owners would have to go through an approval process that's now in a much stricter approval process through the RFU that was in place previously, the RFU would want this to happen. So if the new owners came to them with all the required information, the panel, the financial panel, viability panel that the RFU pulled together would work as fast as they could to make sure this happened. Everything that I'm hearing is the same as last week. There is time if this consortium has the funds. Now, we revealed in the last few days some pretty famous names being attached to this consortium: Jerry Rice, Ray Lewis, Allen Iverson, Julius Irving, like some of the legendary names of American sport. And it's been revealed that Chip Sloan, a lawyer, former player, agent, is involved. These are names, but there's no meat on the bone still. There's no confidence that this consortium have the funds or even the interest to buy London Irish, because it comes back to the same question that we've discussed on this pod. Why would anyone want to buy a club that's saddled with £30 million worth of debt and doesn't own its own stadium, investing in a league at the moment which is fantastic on the field, but is in real financial strife off it. And the mood music that I've been hearing for a while, and I spoke to someone senior in the game today, and it was just reinforced to me again today. I don't believe that this will happen. There is still time if the money all comes together and they step forward with all the documentation and proof of funds. There is time for it to happen, but I'm not hearing anything that's giving me confidence that it will happen.
So just to play devil's advocate here and look at it maybe from the other side, we've just railed off 4 or 5 pretty well-endowed names. So when we're talking about proof of funds and a consortium, if you say those 5 are in it with some other investment groups, I'm going to guess that there's a strong chance that they can produce the funds or proof of funds, that if this was to go ahead, they can. I think that's fair to say. You know, you touched on that the wage bill is around £500,000. I believe not the wage bill they just was paid, but the one before was paid by this group. So there's obviously been some good faith nature of funds coming across. Like, what are the potential sticking points or impasses that are preventing any further development to go on with this negotiation?
So I was told today that while we've all been working on the assumption or on the understanding that the consortium paid the wages in the month before last, I was told today that they didn't, and that was paid by Powerday and Mick Crossan, and that got reported somewhere, and it was never corrected by anyone, and it just gathered speed as sometimes these things do, which again is why it's so important for people involved in this to be upfront and public facing and tell the story of what's going on. So my understanding is that they haven't provided any bridging loans. They haven't stepped in to help pay these salaries during the negotiation process, which again just casts further doubt on their ability to do so. Now, clearly, those names we mentioned, those ex-NFL, NBA players, are going to have mountains of money ready to invest. You know, they're very rich individuals, clearly, but it's about a business plan that has to be pulled together. The RFU they've been burned in the past by just accepting people because they've got some money. The level of proof required now is quite rightly so much higher because of what we've seen happen at other clubs. And so I can't give you the answer as to why these individuals, under the kind of leadership of this lawyer Chip Sloan, have been unable to provide proof of funds. All I can tell you is that they have not provided them, despite promises that they will. And that's why the RFU have put the pressure on, because they're saying, listen, if you've got this, if you can do it, step forward and do it. Let's go and buy out this club. Let's get London Irish moving again. But there, as I've been reporting and saying on this pod for a couple of weeks, there are serious doubts as to whether or not they can actually achieve that. Why it hasn't happened, I'm not on the inside of them. I couldn't tell you why. I can just tell you that it hasn't happened, and it's just growing the uncertainty further and further that this consortium are maybe even playing London Irish along for whatever reason, and it won't ever come to anything.
Well, it's obviously not a good sign if they didn't send that money the month before, because I think that was what a lot of people were holding on to as hope to potentially give good faith that this money was eventually going to come in. But if nothing's been sent at all, no proof of funds, a negotiation that's been going on at least since October, September, with regards to this group, have they made any official statements, any comments, anything? Has we heard anything from Powerday or from Mick in London Irish on that side? And then lastly, like, what do you foresee if you were going to speculate or guess what the issues are? What would you guesstimate of what some of the sticking points are now? And then 2, What do you think of this group? You know, I believe the lawyer in charge had been linked to negotiations with Saracens before. Any more details on that, or lessons to be learned from those incidents that happened, I think, a couple of years ago when Nigel Ray was looking to sell his majority stake in the club?
Yeah, so there were negotiations between Chip Sloan and Nigel Ray, which ultimately didn't go anywhere, and Nigel Ray sold the club to another party called Dominic Sylvester. Um, in terms of other sticking points, I think we know that there's a quite complicated ownership structure at London Irish. There's the training ground, which is their big asset, Hazelwood Training Centre, which has been used by NFL franchises and international rugby teams to train at. That's their big asset. But there's a complicated model there because they built it after selling the previous training ground for property to be built upon. There are different rights over different parcels of Hazelwood, I understand, and the ownership of that is complicated. So if a deal was to be done, I think there's the element of the debt. How much of that's owed to the government? How much of it's owed to Mick Crossan and Powerday? The government debt would be because of loans taken out through the pandemic. All the Premiership clubs had access to government loans, but they all have to be paid back. They tend to be around 15 to 18 million pounds. There's money owed to Mick Crossan at Powerday, the owner. There's any complications over the ownership or the possibilities of Hazelwood, the training ground, what you could do with that land. So I can see those being complications in a deal, but for me, they don't seem to be enormous sticking points. If you're a business looking to invest in another business, these don't seem to be massive details to me. I'm no expert in that field, but I would imagine if that there are business deals going on, takeover deals, investment deals, which are way more complicated than this one. For me, still, the only evidence I have, because your question, has anyone spoken? London Irish are not saying anything. This consortium are not saying anything. They do have someone who's working as their public relations communications advisor, and so far he's not had a very busy job because he's not issued any comments on behalf of the consortium at all. When the deadline was imposed, I guess the messaging coming out of their camp was, well, that's fine. We're moving in the right direction anyway. The deadline doesn't change things for us. It's all going to be fine. The messaging has been from there, and it's all going to be fine. But there's been no meat on the bone. I'm repeating myself here, but we heard, it's all going to be fine from the Worcester owners for weeks and weeks. We heard from them that a takeover was just about to happen, and it never did. We heard that salaries were just about to be paid, and they never were. The circumstances are different, clearly, between Worcester and London Irish, but the narratives are so familiar of empty promises, encouraging words, but with no evidence to back them up. And so very quickly in this, and we saw it in the week after the players and the coaches and the employees weren't paid their April salaries. Within a week, the trust had eroded because there's just nothing to support it. So there's nothing out there that gives me hope, to be honest, for London Irish at the moment. And they've got 13 days, but they've got 8 working days left or something. There's time, but I really fear that we're going to start next season with a 10-team Premiership and London Irish, if they exist as a pro club, it'll be on paper only, the same as Wasps and the same as Worcester.
It's a heartbreakingly sad situation because if you look from the outside in, to get to this point from both parties involved makes no sense. You're Mick. You're trying to sell this asset. You've been, a loyal servant to the club, supported it, for a number of years. And all of a sudden, you're leaving this investment, this company at the brink of going off a cliff, and leaving it exposed to the point that it could be suspended. It could be the end of the club, and then vice versa. you're a new group coming in, looking to spend. I'm sure they're going to have to spend a decent bit of capital to buy this club, and all of a sudden, you are now, putting this negotiation, putting the brand that you're potentially spending a lot of money to sort of, to invest in. You're now damaging that brand, putting it in a position of almost vulnerability to annihilation. And it just seems weird to me that you would do that or put a club in this position if you were willing to put in money long term, build it up, and get to the point where this is a successful club again, finance well, and something that they want to build long term.
From the perspective of Mick Crossan and Powerday, we've been hearing for at least a year, maybe longer, about what they're calling investor fatigue in the Premiership. Club owners who are just starting to tire of the losses, of shouldering the losses. Now, some are way richer than others. Steve Lansdowne, who owns Bristol, is a billionaire. Bruce Craig, who owns Bath, is not far short of that. A multi-millionaire. They could afford it. But there are others for whom it's quite hard work losing £3 million, £4 million a year. And that investor fatigue exists. I think we're seeing in Newcastle, the players that they're allowing to leave, that a real trimming down of the budget so that they can still operate, but they'll be way below the salary cap next season. I'm hearing Exeter within the next few years are going to be way below the salary cap too. There's investor fatigue around at the moment, and I think the biggest example of it is Mick Crossan and London Irish. From everything we hear, he's reached the end of what he's prepared to keep investing, to keep bailing out London Irish. Someone said to me today that this is his last throw of the dice, trying to get this takeover done, and therefore, he won't want this. I'm not saying this is anything that he stepped in with his consortium. When was it? 2013, to take over the club. I'm not saying he wants this, but things are reaching a point where it sounds to me, from everything I'm hearing, and I'm certainly hearing nothing to the contrary, that he's run his course as the owner of London Irish. And if he can't find an investor, if he can't find someone to take it on, then I think he might be ready to pull the plug on it.
Sad times indeed. I think the last thing I want to touch on is, some of the rumblings I heard from internally at London Irish is that, obviously the players, staff, everyone's still quite in the dark of what's going on, as these negotiations are being handled by, my understanding, Mick, the finance guy at Powerday, and this consortium. But there is a meeting on Friday expected to be with London Irish's captain, the RPA, the RFU, representative from this new group, and either Mick or a representative from Powerday to try and reassure the playing group of that this is actually going ahead. Have you heard anything on that?
No, that's news to me, Alex, about a meeting on Friday, but I will look into it. And the one thing I'd say is I think to reassure employees that it's going to go ahead, they're going to need some evidence. They're going to need more than just some flashy names from who've played in the NFL and the NBA to give them confidence. This is players' jobs, coaches' jobs, backroom staff. It's their livelihood. This meeting to give them assurances, they're going to need some evidence. We've seen, as we said a bit earlier, in that week when the salary hadn't come in, the players asked for guarantees that they were insured to play in the final game. The club said, yes, your insurance is in place. They went back to the club and said, we want documentary evidence that we are insured. So if they needed documentary evidence for that, for anyone to be at all encouraged, they're going to need evidence that this is moving forward, that this can happen. And now, we all hope that on Friday, the employees of the club are shown evidence that the documents have been supplied to the RFU and this has moved forward. I'm being all doom and gloom because I'm only hearing negative. If it happens and they pull it out of the bag, brilliant. But I can't imagine Matt Rogerson and the employees sitting in a room and hearing more words of, oh, we're nearly there, we promise you this is going to happen, we're nearly there. If I was their representative from the RPA, if I was Matt Rogerson, the London Irish captain, I'd be demanding evidence to back it up because the words so far haven't counted for anything.
Agreed, mate. And I think that's the tough position that the players and staff are in, is that they have this sense of loyalty and collective, unity, and wanting to sort of stay strong in the face of adversity from external pressures and everything, which I completely understand. But then they're also in a position where, if you look at what happened to Wasps and Worcester players, of potentially being massively exposed and massively left vulnerable, not just for themselves, but for their families, for livelihoods, for all sorts of career options and all these issues. And I think if any of them are listening to this, would implore them to stand up for yourselves and be proactive and not just trust what's going on and try and get as much clarity, try and make as much noise, open up, even if you have to be public to get transparency of what the hell is going on. I do feel it's a very unreasonable position that all of these staff have been put in with this uncertainty and this lack of any real information or updates of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the RPA will need to step in and show real strong leadership. But I think we're seeing already, from what I'm hearing, there are players who are finding provisional alternatives. Players who've found clubs in France will take them if this goes wrong. Other clubs in England, rival Premiership clubs, are submitting lists of players to agents who they would be interested in signing. Now, no surprise, Henry Arundel, Tom Pearson, these guys, young English talent, Ben Loader, they'll be top of those lists. And those players will be fine. They will find contracts at clubs. They may have to follow Jack Willis to go and play in France for a bit, but they will be fine. It's the next rung down, and maybe the academy players that you worry about, and so that's where the RPA come in because they will look after. The RPA won't be worried about Henry Arundel or Tom Pearson or Ben Loader, these guys, that they will be worried about the third choice hooker and the fourth choice tight head, um, who aren't the superstars. They're the ones who need the support of the RPA, but also clearly now, as I mentioned earlier, of Premiership Rugby and the RFU to help them find another club, find another career path. I'm hearing talk of a benevolent fund being set up to just help support these players financially. Now, that wasn't in place previously. We all know that the governance of the game was poor and needed to be overhauled. And I think perhaps the hands-on attitude that's being shown by the union and Premiership Rugby now demonstrates how quickly they've learned the lessons from the start of this season. They don't have the authority to save the club themselves. They don't have the money or the power to do that. But it sounds to me like every effort is being made to at least help support the staff should the worst happen. These are all contingencies, as we said earlier. We all sit here hoping that they're not required, but every indication at the moment points to the fact that they will be.
I think it's a good place to wrap it up, mate. I wish it was on a more positive note, but unfortunately, I think it's wait and see and hope for the best. And, fingers crossed the players get some good news on Friday. God forbid if maybe that meeting is cancelled or postponed or doesn't happen, what that might do to some of the worries, but just hoping for the best in this scenario and just also really appreciate all your insight and information and have to credit you for sort of being the real one who broke this story and have been right in the loop and in the know with updates.
Well, listen, it's we have some great times doing this job as a rugby journalist, and this isn't a fun story to have to cover, but it is a really important news story to cover in the narrative of this season and where professional rugby is going. I found it really important to try and stay on top of it and find out what's going on and put pressure on people to take the right kind of action. And whether that's the current owners, the prospective buyers, the RFU, Premiership Rugby. I think it's really important. I'm off to Dublin tomorrow for the European finals, the Champions Cup final on Saturday will be a belting game between Leinster and La Rochelle, and those are the occasions that we love, and those are the privileged occasions I get to go to as a rugby journalist, and they're a joy. I wouldn't say covering stories like this are a joy, but they're really important, and it's one of the reasons why we're here to do the job that we do. So yeah, I appreciate your words. Thank you, and we'll keep trying to tell the truth and uncover what's going on, and keep our readers and listeners informed about the latest at London Irish and around the Prem.
Legend, mate. Speak soon for sure.
Sure. Cheers, Alex.
Always a pleasure to have Alex on, and I do think he feels bad because I always bring him on to talk about tough subjects. And that is a really tough subject. And, I'm sure there's potentially some people maybe at London Irish or maybe around who get defensive of this even being covered or talked about. But I would just say to them and to everyone that this is a major news story. This could potentially be the end of a great club in Premiership history. We've seen two others go down this year. I think it's criminal to not talk about it and want to cover it for me. And I think the only way that potentially this gets resolved is by bringing light and transparency to the story and not just leaving it behind closed doors to hope for the best and potentially leave a lot of people in a very vulnerable position if this does fall through. So thanks to everyone for listening to that. And now to continue this pod and look back at the semi-finals of Premiership Rugby, something that hasn't been getting enough clout this season is how good the product has been on field because of off-field issues. We're going to break down those two games with Ross Hamilton by the numbers. Lots of insight. Let's get into it. And we are joined again by the returning Ross Hamilton, performance analyst, fresh off, two pretty exciting Premiership semi-finals, maybe one a bit more one-sided than the other, which we talked a little bit about last week on the show. But Ross, welcome back, mate. What'd you make of it?
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me. Yeah, two different games, weren't they? We probably expected that, but both exciting in different ways. I enjoyed both. Maybe I'm a rugby fan, sure, but I thought the way the Saracens and Northampton played was exciting, was open kind of rugby. The Sale-Leicester one was a little bit more traditional, perhaps, but an amazing contest nonetheless. And obviously right down to the wire. It was a fascinating watch.
For people that did listen last week to our previews, it did follow a lot of the themes of what you talked about in those games.
Yeah, I hope so. I think going to show you now as well that with the stats as well, it kind of reflected that, which was nice. But obviously, that was just based off of their stats for the season. So it's hard to change that in a knockout game. You're not going to go a million miles away from what you're sort of tried and tested for the season. So perhaps expected to see. But yeah, both games went the way we perhaps thought they would do. Both still great, though. Still great to watch.
And then if we look at the first game, Northampton versus Sarries, we'll go chronologically. What were your key takeaways from that game, say numbers-wise?
Yeah, look, so the big one for me was actually sort of how much pressure Northampton had. I don't think I felt that watching the game. I don't know if you did either, but they had a huge amount of possession time and territory. So Northampton had 22 and a half minutes of possession, Saracens just under 16. So a load more ball in hand. Northampton had 65% territory and Saracens only 35. And again, sort of watching that back or thinking about the game, I didn't necessarily get that feeling, but Northampton really did put Saracens under pressure. They just didn't have any sort of final element for me, and I'll go through some more details of that. So Saracens had to make 221 tackles in a game. Very rarely you see over 200 tackles in any match. So that's a huge amount. Northampton had to make half of that, near enough, 112. So Northampton was sort of the instigators in putting the pressure onto Saracens, but again, not quite the output. One thing I mentioned just at this point, Saracens won 14 turnovers in the game. They averaged the most in the competition with 8. So they nearly doubled their best average number per game. Northampton had 4. So you had 10 more turnovers in a game to a team. You're not really going to get very far. Whatever you do, we said this last week, whatever Northampton do, they make meters, they make line breaks, you lose the ball at the end, you don't score a try. It's irrelevant. So that was a huge factor. So one big thing with the game was the output. So how about these for numbers? Saracens made 3 more meters in total than Northampton did. They had 70 fewer carries. Sarries had 105 carries, Northampton 175. Like a huge difference, and they couldn't even make as many meters as Saracens in total. It's, again, the output element of it just wasn't there, just as a sort of a direct comparison. It's 2.6 meters per carry for Northampton, 4.4 for Saracens. So you're getting on towards 2 meters extra every carry. That's huge. That adds up so much by the end of the game, as it shows. Sarries made 9 clean breaks, Northampton just 3. The other thing we talked about last week, which was going to be big, was ruck speed. Northampton, very, very fast, fastest in the league, have been all season, and they use that to really good effect of breaking their opposition down. Now, they were actually faster than Sarries by 1/10 of a second, 3.6 seconds for their ruck speed. But that was slower than their average for the tournament, for the Premiership this season. So they slowed down against Saracens. Saracens 3.7, but that's a dramatic increase. That's half a second quicker per ruck than their average. So whilst Northampton was still quicker, it was Saracens sort of gaining that edge in terms of speed, overall speed at those rucks, that I think got them on the front foot. And just to sort of compound that, Saracens had more rucks under 2 seconds than Northampton did. And it's those rucks. The average speed is great, but that includes defensive rucks and kicking and things. It's those absolutely lightning quick, rapid rucks, 23% for Saracens and 21% for Northampton. That makes the difference when you're trying to convert, when you're trying to break teams down and get into the right areas and score. Those rucks are the ones that count.
And when you look at, say, the contrast in output, say, attacking-wise, do you put that down to Sarri's attack being, that much superior, or is it more Sarri's defense and their ability to nullify Northampton?
Perhaps a little bit of both. I think Saracens' attack was slightly better than their average throughout the season, so they were able to implement that in such a big game in a semi-final. But again, we did speak about this, didn't we, that Saracens for us were the team who had the elements both sides of the ball. Very good in attack, but very good in defence. And they did stop Northampton a lot better. I had a look at their sort of red zone numbers, so their efficiency of converting when they had those chances. Saracens had 9 entries and Northampton 8, so only just had 1 more. But points per entry, Saracens 3.9, Northampton 1.5. So way less than half of the conversion of Saracens. So you add that up, and you're just not going to get the sort of final result. The amount of points that you get for the back of that just isn't the same. And just a note as well to say that whilst Northampton had an entry less, Saracens had 11 phases in total in Northampton's red zone from 9 entries, and yet scored all of those points and came away with their tries. Northampton had 57 phases compared to 11. Like a huge difference and a huge amount of pressure. We saw it with possession time, territory, carries, but they just didn't do anything with it. It just didn't account for enough. So Saracens' defence in that case, to answer your question, I think it was fantastic to stop Northampton. Their attack managed to execute at the sort of the same level, if not a little bit higher. So therefore the outcome was as it was.
And that's really, in a nutshell, what you sort of, tipped as the most probable outcome, coming into the game, is that, both teams had, reasonably effective attacks, but where you saw the difference in the game was Saracens and their defensive aspect to their game and sort of seemed to favour them and feel like they just had another level than Saints.
Yeah, Saints for me going into that game had to get absolutely everything right, perform at their very, very best to have a chance. If Saracens did what they did and implement their defence and just get on the front foot, stop anything from Northampton, it was going to be very hard for Northampton to maintain those levels. That was the big thing. Northampton maintained or had those averages across the season, but they only played Saracens a couple of times, won one, lost one. But it was implementing that in a semi-final. The experience of Saracens, they know how to get their game into big match situations and come out on top. And I think we did say that. It would have been very hard for Northampton. Had a very small spell, didn't they, just out for the second half, where they showed a bit of life and got some element of their game into it with Alex Mitchell, very prevalent, but just never enough for me. And I think showed never enough to beat Saracens.
All right, let's park semi-final 1. Let's move on to semi-final number 2, which saw Sale Sharks hosting Leicester Tigers. Obviously, Leicester defending champions. George Ford, I thought was magnificent on the day for Sale. And again, this one, without tooting your horn too much, went quite similar to how you predicted, sort of, battle of the defenses and the physicality and the packs and who was going to come out on top. And I thought probably the kicking game as well from George Ford at times really gave Sale an edge at times in that game.
Yeah, agreed. Again, it just goes back to the fact that those teams play like that across the whole season. It's within them. It's very hard to change your style suddenly when you come to a semi-final game. Not that you'd want to. You want to implement what you've been practicing all year. And yeah, so some of the numbers. The first one, obviously, straight away, we looked at was kicking. So Sale kicked away their possession 73% of the time. Leicester 77%. And to give you a contrast, so I mean, Saracens were typical of this game style and probably the originators of it. In their semi-final against Northampton, they kicked away 58% of the time. So far, far lower than even Sale, who kicked away less than Leicester. Northampton only kicked away possession 45% of the time. So this game specifically with these two teams, they employed exactly the style that we thought they would, that they've gone to all year, kicking away 3/4 of all of their possession, near enough. So that's just sort of how it went, how we saw the game being very tight, very back and forth, could have gone either way with a little bit of control from George Ford, as you said, sort of towards the end especially, but got them over the line. But very, very tight game throughout, and it showed in some of the numbers, some of the big ones that came through.
And I just liked, Leicester's, I thought, resilience in that first half to keep the game close, even though they were under, huge amounts of pressure at time, really is what, to me, made it an exciting second half, because on a different day, I felt Sale could have blown Leicester away with a couple of tries. They missed a few opportunities that they probably were kicking themselves at half time, but they rolled up their sleeves and eventually got it done.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, in terms of that game style and how it panned out and what we saw, I think the kicking game came into it so much that it did sort of stifle a lot of attack, and those possessions and opportunities that each team had in the right areas were then very hard to convert. There was so much pressure on those with the defences, as you say, being so good. But I looked through some of the numbers just to sort of see how close it was. Sale had 127 carries in the game. Leicester made fewer than 100 carries, 95 carries in a game, which again is a number is actually quite unheard of. I very rarely see that. Less than 100 carries in a game is very few, just shows how much they were kicking the ball away. But then in terms of output, just so limited. They made 2 line breaks in the entire game. Sale only made 3. There's 5 line breaks in the whole game. Saracens made 9 themselves. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of output that we were working with. Similarly with offloads, Leicester only made 3 offloads compared to Sale's 11. The gain line success for Leicester was 33%. Teams are looking at 50% sort of as a guideline to get a decent return on your gain line success, carries over the gain line. So to be down at a third of all your carries getting over the gain line is very limited. It's not going to give you that much go forward in attack. Both teams' ruck speeds actually was 5 seconds dead, 5 seconds flat. And we were talking again for Saracens and Northampton, you're 3.5 seconds, that kind of speed. So very, very slow. They're not aiming to break teams down by causing chaos and disorganization from quick rucks. They're setting up their kicks to then go and chase and defend from the opposition territory. But then again, limited in terms of chances and what they did once they got the ball in those right areas. Sale had 7 entries to the opposition, 22, Leicester 6. They had exactly the same conversion rate of efficiency of 1.71. So again, significantly lower than the Saracens, for example, in the semi-final, just weren't able to get those scores on the pitch, especially for Leicester, having very, very little output. And I mentioned that last week. That was my big one, that their kicking game is great, fine, but you've got to do something with the ball at some point. You've got to score at some point. Even if you start from the opposition 22, you've got to do something with it, and the numbers show they didn't really do that. And one final one, perhaps sort of as a nod to sort of defensive efforts from Sale as well, was how much they stifled and just the margins of difference when you can pressurize in defense a team's attack. So Sale made 7 turnovers, won 7 turnovers in the game. Leicester just 3. So again, we talked about the difference between Saracens and Northampton of being 10 difference, but 4 turnovers per game is significant in such a tight game when it came down to really fine margins, and a very similar number as well. Penalties conceded. Sale conceded just 9 penalties and Leicester 12. So again, those 3 extra penalties, those 4 extra turnovers conceded, that starts adding up to a big difference to give Sale, in this case, more opportunities to score, to kick the points, or to take those opportunities in the red zone, which Leicester just weren't able to do. Fascinating game, really great, really close all the way through, which was fantastic. Leicester were hampered with Andre Pollard going down at the start. I think George Ford really came to the fore and controlled that. Maybe that would be different with Pollard in the game. Obviously not to be, never going to know. But it did sort of go to plan as how we thought it might do based on the stats.
No, definitely. It was an interesting contest, and, it was a battle of who could sort of, do their style better, and I think Sale prevailed, mate. I think that's a great place to cap this one off. Obviously, we'll get you back on next week to preview the final in more detail as there's a week break until we get that back here on CNBC and Peacock TV in America. But Ross, I just want to again thank you for your time and your contribution and all that insight and analysis, because I know our listeners and viewers really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, mate. Very happy to do it. Love chatting about rugby, so always happy to come back. Thanks for having me.
And that is a wrap on this week's show. Thank you to both our guests, Alex Lowe and Ross Hamilton. Thank you to The Insight. Thank you all of you at home for listening or watching this on NBC Sports YouTube. We really appreciate all the support, especially our loyal ones who've been here since pretty much day one, since we started in 2017. Thank you so much, as we've sort of, taken a while to get to the point where we can have week-to-week pods, but we're now in that place. We really appreciate it. We hope you've enjoyed this season, as we've got one or two more episodes to round it out, as we have Premiership finals coming up a week after this one, coming here on NBC Sports, with that game on CNBC and live on Peacock TV. But for now, that's all from us here at NBC Sports. Myself, Alex Corbacero. Thanks again for all the support. We'll see you next week.